When Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 111st birthday with a party of special magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton.
Welcome to the Wayward Wizards podcast. Today we're reading chapter 1 of The Fellowship of the Ring, a chapter entitled A Long Expected Party. My name is Zach.
I'm Logan.
So Logan, what happened in chapter 1? What happened this week?
A lot of party planning, a lot of party throwing, and then Bilbo's out. He's out of the story very quickly.
Like as soon as he arrives.
There's a lot of ring fingering happening in this.
There's a lot of fingering rings in your pocket. There's a lot of talking about buying local.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gossip.
I was, there's a lot of dwarves in this chapter.
More dwarves than I remembered.
Sort of background dwarves. We don't really get names. We get names of basically everybody else in the Shire, but none of the dwarves are named.
None of them, it's a long history of underappreciating dwarfs.
We get Hamfast Gamgee's neighbor's name for no reason. I mean, just important to know that person's name.
A lot of breakdowns of Hobbit gift giving practices.
Yeah, a lot of culture, which is kind of fun.
A lot of speculations about the nature of Frodo's parents' death.
Yeah, I was struck by that. What's his dad's name? Is it Drogo?
Drogo.
No. Yeah, and he's a big
Drogo.
He's a big fat hobbit.
He is fond of his victuals, as they say.
Yeah.
Fond of his victuals, he was.
I think it's interesting. The first little section here, the way that my chapter is broken up, is that we have this description of Bilbo's perpetual youth.
Yeah.
And inexhaustible wealth.
Seemingly inexhaustible, yes.
And we're told it will have to be paid for. It isn't natural, and trouble will come of it.
Yeah, and I think that we ultimately find out that's true. That the perpetual youth and inexhaustible wealth that he has is because of this very evil thing. And so there's some kind of plain hobbit wisdom that comes out here that it will have to be paid for. I mean, he's being stretched. He's being like wraithified, and he's becoming more and more like Gollum himself.
Right. And the inciting action or the inciting event for this story happened in the last story.
Yeah. So that might be a point to point out, is that, and this is often said about the Fellowship of the Ring, that the tone starts out in a very different space than the Lord of the Rings that we know and love as a whole.
Yeah.
When we think of the tone of Lord of the Rings, we think of this epic, grand, dangerous quest. But it starts out very light. We have
the first
a birthday party.
Is about a birthday party.
Yeah, and there's a play on words from The Hobbit, which is the Hobbit begins with an unexpected party, and the Lord of the Rings starts with a long expected party.
Yeah,
and you find out that there's this just kind of jolly, generous, kind of mad old guy. He's turning 111 years old.
Yeah.
And everybody thinks he's crazy. Right. And they're like, he's insanely rich, and he went off to God knows where and did God knows what. And the story starts out with him throwing a magnificent birthday party for him and his adopted nephew, his adopted heir.
Yeah.
And one of the funny things about this being a sequel to The Hobbit is that obviously The Hobbit is a children's book. And
Yeah.
while there are parts of The Hobbit that are terrifying and there are parts of it that are much more complex than I think people give it credit for, the Lord of the Rings was written in the beginning as a children's book. And so the first chapter has that tone. It lacks a lot of the seriousness that will come later. And I think that in The Hobbit, especially when the dwarves are telling really the reader, but Bilbo, what their quest is, and they're talking about the kingdom of Dale.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that they talk about is the fact that they're world renowned for their toy making.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And we get that here. He buys presents that are of real dwarf make, and he has them shipped over from
They
Dale.
say Dale on
And
them.
they're these like magical miniature instruments that are perfectly well made. And so a reason that's given in The Hobbit for Smaug coming and taking over the Lonely Mountain and destroying Dale was because of its wealth. And Tolkien says that they're famous for toy making. And so you can see that if you're like a child reading The Hobbit for the first time, the idea that the dragon comes because he wants all their toys.
Yeah, it connects
It's
to
a
your
very
life.
connects to the life of a child, and it's like an entryway for the child. So that I think it's interesting that that's echoed immediately in the first chapter of the Lord of the Rings. You have the toys
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the
That's really
yeah
that is interesting. And even with the sort of lighthearted way that the first book of certainly the first book of the first or the first part, I guess, of the first like collected book,
right
that he does sprinkle in little bits of foreshadowing.
yes
It has to be paid for and it isn't natural. That foreshadows the whole thing, right?
yeah
The whole
yeah
story is about that in a way.
yeah
And and even though, we're talking about pavilions and we're talking about dwarves and we're talking about fireworks and we're talking about all this stuff, every so often there's just a beat where the ring is a problem.
yeah
The Bilbo himself is a problem for not problematic, but he's a problem. He's a mystery to be solved for the people of the Shire. We're told that he doesn't have any friends, which I think is really interesting. He's this kook.
he's
He's this kook.
solitary.
He's solitary, and it's only when his much younger cousins start to kind of come of age that he starts to have people around, and then that's when he leaves.
Yeah,
Right. So he makes these connections, and then it's time to leave. Um, but all of
there's
that
almost a
action,
sense that he's so different from the rest of the hobbits,
yeah,
especially in Hobbiton. He's so different that he almost can't come back home
yeah.
again from his journey.
And he was probably always a little odd, right? Like otherwise he never would have left. But and Gandalf maybe wouldn't have identified him as a person who was worth taking on this quest. But yeah, there is a sense that he can't come home again until he finds, he does find in Frodo kind of a kindred spirit, I think.
Yeah,
And maybe that has something to do with Frodo's, the fact that Frodo is orphaned. Um,
right.
and so Frodo has some
Outsider
outsider.
status.
Yeah, he's sort of on the edge of the inside, right? He loves the Shire, he loves his fellow hobbits, but there's something he's like, I could leave. And as much as Bilbo is convinced that Frodo still loves the Shire, Frodo would have left with him if he had, if he had asked. So yeah, kind of a kooky old guy up in Bag End.
Yeah, and he's so strange that people talk about him behind his back. He's a source of gossip. And so we get this kind of window into Hobbit culture in this pub called the Ivy Bush. And you got Hamfast, Gamgee, Sam's dad, and it says that he's holding an attentive audience. And he kind of puts in a word for him. He's like, they're all talking about how crazy he is. And he goes, a very nice, well-spoken, gentle hobbit is Mr. Bilbo, as I've always said. And he kind of makes a case for why Bilbo's a good, upstanding guy. There's the great line in there about how he's, very free with his money. He certainly doesn't have like this hoard of dragon gold that everybody is saying is in tunnels, and
he's not miserly or anything like that. Yeah.
No, he's not like dragon like himself. He's not sitting on a hoard of gold in Bag End.
Right.
And he talks about how his son Sam is really fond of him and Frodo, and he says like he even's teaching him his letters, meaning no trouble by it. Meaning
no harm. Yeah.
No, and you get kind of an insight into the class distinctions there, where it'd be strange for a hobbit of Sam's station to be literate. And so Gaffer warned Sam throughout the book, or throughout the first few chapters here, don't go getting yourself all mixed up with elves and wizards and all that. Right. You're more about cabbages and potatoes, like me.
I know you like those stories, but
know your place.
Yeah, know your place. And I think it's even said that Hamfast is sort of the expert in the neighborhood on root vegetables. So it's not even cabbages, like a cabbage is like a flower, right? But he's an expert on stuff that grows under the ground. Like the most kind of, I don't know, basic types of vegetables. Literally grounded. Right? Like his job is in the ground, and it's not just on the ground, it's in the ground.
And Handfast is like presented as old, but
he's young compared to Bilbo, right?
Yeah, he's like, I remember 60 years ago when I was just a lad,
right?
Bilbo coming back and he didn't have more than a couple chests. And so I mean, even though he's ancient, Bilbo is like old by Hobbit standards.
But something about Bilbo's kookiness is sort of instructive to me, I think, because one of the things that I like, one of my fears in life is that I'll become a like grouchy old man who like closes myself off to like new experiences and ideas.
Yeah.
But Bilbo does not read as old in this chapter. He reads
he's
as
playful.
Yeah, even though he's tired and worn out and sort of stretched too thin, he's playful, and he's, I think it means something that he's friends with Frodo and Merry and Sam. Friends in a way that that he maintains kind of a lightness, and that's I don't know. There's something there to hold on to, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And you see a little bit later how he's just committed to a bit. Like the entire party was just so he could play a joke, and
I love when he says that I've got 144 of you here, one gross, and it pisses off the Sackville Bagginses, and no one laughs, and he's just, you could just imagine he's like, I'm gonna
a gross indeed.
I'm gonna offend all these hobbits. It's so great.
Or even, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, but even when he insists on saying proud foots instead of proud feet.
Oh yeah, so good.
When he's corrected by a member of that family and how to say it correctly, and he's like, he
just repeats
it. Proud foots. Yeah, he insisted. Yeah. And when he starts to leave, and he says like, it'd be a shame to waste the joke by not getting rid of the ring. There's this sense that the entire affair, the entire party was just this joke so that he could bear to leave the ring. It's like a little gift to himself.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I mean, I think we get in this scene in the Ivy Bush, I think we get a really cool insight into Hobbit culture. I think Tolkien called it hobbitry. The way they talk to each other, the way that they the way that they think of outsiders.
Yeah.
They call them outlandish, and even people who are still in the Shire but live on the wrong side of the water.
Yeah. Right.
They're like, oh, those weirdos over there
Yeah.
riding boats. And they live in these warrens.
Right.
They have 100 family members living with them. They're just weird.
Yeah.
And not to be trusted. And they're outlandish and strange. And I think we think of the hobbits because we know about the whole story of Frodo and Sam and Merry and Pippin. Those are the four hobbits that we get to know best, but they're in themselves kind of strange as hobbits, and they
Yes.
maintain a lot of like what makes the best of hobbits. But hobbits aren't perfect. They're not like these saintly little angelic creatures in this perfect little heaven of this quaint, verdant
Right.
region called the Shire. I mean, they gossip and they steal,
Yeah.
presents that aren't like there's a naughtiness to them.
Right.
They're not these like perfect saintly creatures. They have character flaws, and I think when we see the gossiping about Bilbo, and kind of speculations about ill-gotten treasure, you know there's a distrust of people who are different, and but there's also like these social rules, like when Sandyman suggests that Drogo pulled his wife in, or that was it that he pushed his wife in and she pulled him after.
I can't remember. Let's see if we can find it here. Drowned.
Oh, here it is right here. It says, and I heard she pushed him in and he pulled her in after
Yeah,
him,
that's right.
said Sandyman, the Hobbiton Miller.
That's pretty dark. I mean,
oh, but Gaffer is like, whoa, Sandyman.
And Sandyman
like,
is kind of a jerk. But
slow your roll. He's like, you shouldn't listen to all you hear, Sandyman, said the Gaffer, who didn't much like the Miller. There isn't no call to go talking of pushing and pulling. Boats are quite tricky enough for those who sit still without looking further for the cause of trouble.
Yeah.
So there's this sense that to say that a hobbit would murder another hobbit is like a bridge too far.
It's not outside of the realm of possibility. I mean, it's not polite to suggest that, but I think it is. I mean, there's a way in which I think, especially in some of the adaptations that you see, that like the Shire is like some kind of Eden, where nothing bad ever happened. And it's like, I mean, the Shire is protected by forces outside that make life pretty ideal because there's not any kind of invading, force from outside, and there's plenty, right? Like,
right.
And so there's not a lot of anxiety around that, but it's not as though, like you're saying, I think naughty is the right word for it because it's a childlike mischief in a way.
Mischievous.
It's mischievous. It's sort of impolite, but like no one's really getting hurt necessarily.
Right.
But the fact that somebody like Sandyman, who's kind of, an asshole, he will push it to that level where it's like, well, I heard they murdered each other,
Right. And that's like impolite. But that tendency is still there. They like to gossip as much as you and I do.
It's not unimaginable that something really terrible would happen like that, Right. And then Frodo's orphaned, and that's the reality, that this kid is orphaned, like, right? Like his parents are dead, and he, like, that is not an Edenic vision, right? Like of a place that's perfect. It's a place that has things that happen that are tragic.
Yeah, and there's this long history in literature, but even in like modern storytelling, like superheroes, how many superheroes are orphans? Spider-Man, Batman, Superman.
Yep.
There's this idea that a child who endures tragedy unimaginable, like the worst thing that can happen to a child,
Yeah.
is the one who will kind of take up the mantle of the hero.
Right. Certainly, I mean, it's certainly in most Disney movies, right? Like,
Yeah,
especially ones from
absolutely.
when we were kids. Like, they all, they all,
Everyone's an orphan.
everyone's an orphan, or even newer movies like Finding Nemo. Like, Mom, where's
Yeah.
Mom, right? And not only that, but he lost his whole everybody, all of his brothers and sisters, and he's got
Yeah.
a bum
Yeah.
Finn, So there has to be something that sort of sets you apart that like makes the hero's journey like a possibility.
Right.
To get into that, sort of story circle type of way of reading. So,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's interesting, and then we also get the kind of tension between the Baggins, well, certainly Bilbo, and then the Sackville Bagginses.
Yes.
There's envy, or if not jealousy, there, and we get a lot of that in this chapter, actually. Lobelia and what's her husband's name?
Lotho.
Lotho, yeah.
Yeah.
About how much they have this
Grudge.
and it even feels like something that just has existed between the two families.
Absolutely. And one thing about Tolkien is that he was very British, as I'm sure will come up,
Yeah.
1,000 times as we're talking about this book. But uh, he had a real distrust for anything French, and he didn't like French food.
Yeah.
He didn't like French words making their way into English,
Mm-hmm.
and so even the name Sackville Baggins is a very French word. It's a very French name, and the kind of like home that the story starts in is what we all know and love from having read the books and seen the movie. The Hobbit hole, Bag End.
Right.
Bag End is an English phrase, an English language word for a house at the end of a road.
Right.
And in American English, we call that a cul-de-sac,
Right.
which literally means the end of a bag.
Oh,
And so
sack. Yeah. Right.
sack, the end of a bag end. And so the Sackville Bagginses, Ville is like a French,
French word for
like
a
word
town.
for a town. So
Yeah.
Sackville Bagginses, they are kind of held in opposition to the very British English
Yeah.
way, a simple way of saying things, the end of a bag versus a cul-de-sac, and they see themselves as like important, and they have a very self-important view of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is held in contrast to Bilbo, who doesn't take himself too seriously and is very generous. And I think we all have examples of people using like kind of French words to sound fancy.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a certain je ne sais quoi about people who use French to sound fancy, and so
Yeah.
that's like a little inside joke that Tolkien is employing there.
Yeah. Bilbo's stuffy French cousins.
Yeah, exactly. Self-important.
And it's funny that they have the same. It's almost like they have the same last name twice, like Sackville
Yeah.
Baggins, like like
Baggins. Yeah.
the bags.
Yeah.
Like, why say your name twice when you could just say it once? It's sort of very English to sort of have that kind of reservation about yourself or your importance.
Snobby, self-important people.
But yeah, snobby, self-important people like are gonna say their name twice.
Yeah,
in two different ways,
and have one of them be French.
and one of them's French because it gives you some kind of air of whatever extra respectability or something like that.
So yeah, I mean, hobbits, not angels, not saints.
Right.
They're people just like us, simple people, though the place they live is very safe. It's a place where the idea that somebody would be murdered in their borders is kind of a unexpected, outcome, something that would be seen as rude to even suggest. And I think, and we'll get to this in like several years, but in the Scouring of the Shire, Frodo even says no hobbit has ever killed another hobbit on purpose
Yeah, that's
in the
right.
Shire.
And that's like, yeah, that's like the end of the story, right? I mean,
That's like
basically.
a audacious claim. There's never been a murder. So I think that's
Fascinating.
why
Yeah.
Sandyman suggesting that Frodo's parents, killed each other on a boat is like a faux pas.
Yeah, he's had a few too many drinks at the Ivy Bush at this point, and he's just a jerk. Like he's just a,
He's well, he's a miller. He's a
yeah,
miller,
yeah.
and in
I want you. You've mentioned that to me before. I want you to talk about that idea. I'm particularly interested because I have in-laws who are millers, so I'd like them to hear. Yeah, I'd like them to hear what their name means.
yeah, and I really owe this insight to Corey Olson from Mythgard Academy,
The great Corey Olson. Yeah.
Tolkien professor himself. He pointed out that in English literature from time immemorial, millers are untrustworthy. They're kind of seedy characters who are the foils of a lot of stories. They're the villains of a lot of stories, and this goes back to the fact that millers were responsible for the flow of usable grain in villages, and so they would receive wheat from farmers. They would mill the wheat, they'd grind it down so that it could be baked into bread. But everybody needed to have that service done because nobody would have big, heavy stone mill. And so they were this like industrial center of a shire,
Right.
a town, and they controlled the price. And so if you brought your wheat to them and you didn't like the price, tough. You needed your flour to be ground in order to turn it into something that you could eat. And so this is another little inside joke that kind of finds its way into the beginning of the story here, that and it seems like Hamfast and Sandyman have this conflict. There's this kind of tension between the two of them, that they're still sitting down and drinking together, but you can tell they don't like each other
Yeah.
very much. And that will kind of echo into the next generation between Sam and Sandyman's son, who ends up being kind of this villain in the industrialization of the Shire. So
Yeah.
it seems like he's kind of like primed to be influenced by Saruman later.
Yeah.
And you kind of see the beginnings of that here.
It's a very early insight into some of kind of Tolkien's conservatism,
Yes.
His, and I think the tension between, the idea of like a garden or a gardener, a farmer, and then, yeah, as you said, this sort of industrial choke point where, the political economy has been set up in such a way that there's a person or a family who is controlling the sort of, well, I don't want to say means of production.
I was about to say the means of production, the flow of
the means of
the economy.
Well, yeah, and like in this case, like we're talking about bread, like it's literally like the essence of life, right?
Yeah. Everybody needs it.
It depends on this one person and one place and one piece of technology in a way that Tolkien is pretty suspicious of. He sort of values some kind of self-sufficiency or something like that.
Absolutely.
That kind of like, I think he's also, suspicious of that kind of accumulation of power by somebody who isn't, like ordained by God to have that power.
Right.
Like it's fine when it's Aragorn, but like Sandyman is not up to the task.
Sandyman ain't no Aragorn.
Exactly. Yeah.
I know Aragorn, sir. And Sandyman, you are no Aragorn.
You are no Aragorn, indeed.
Well, let's move on to the good part.
Yeah.
because right after this little, gossip sesh at the Ivy Bush, here comes, my favorite character, I think many people's favorite character, the introduction of Gandalf.
Gandalf.
G for grand.
I'm having a hard time finding it here. I love that he Tolkien includes these runes, the large red G.
Yeah.
And then we get a little, drawing, and the elf rune. That was Gandalf's mark, of course.
Yes.
And the old man was Gandalf the Wizard, whose fame in the Shire was due mainly to his skill with fire, smokes, and lights. I love that we get a detail that later on that the longer that Gandalf practices making fireworks, the better he gets at it. I was like, reading that this time, I was like, oh, interesting. Like, he's not just I mean, it's magic, but it's like, you can get better at it, and even
magic as an art.
Yeah, even Gandalf, who's, I mean, how old is he supposed to be? 1,000 years old or something like that. Like
oh gosh,
or older. Well, I mean, obviously he's an eternal whatever being, but in this current form, like he gets better, and there's no reason for him to be good at fireworks. Like it's obviously something that he just likes,
and talking about like, Gandalf as a character.
Yeah.
Because if you've read Lord of the Rings as many times as you and I have, we think of Gandalf as this fully developed character who is, this eternal, angelic, magical being who's sent by the gods, the Valar, to, be the enemy of Sauron.
Right. And that is not in the text right here.
No. And, in The Hobbit, Gandalf is a wizard, and it seems like wizards are this like professional class. It's, these like professional magicians who go about looking for adventures and helping people, in their goals, but they seem to be like people you could essentially call up and hire.
Yeah.
They're like, they're professional. And, getting a little bit further on, as Gandalf and Bilbo start to talk about the ring, Bilbo says like, why do you, like, who are you to tell me what I can do with my own things? You didn't care about any of the other stuff that I got on my journey.
Right.
Why are you always bugging me about the ring? And Gandalf says, essentially, I have a professional interest in this ring.
Yeah.
So I think you can see in this early part of the chapter, you can kind of see the myth of Gandalf growing, but also he still kind of has this identity that he had in The Hobbit, which is a much lower version of who he'll eventually become.
Yeah.
So let's look at, let's get into the party. This is where, like, one thing that you mentioned to me while we were preparing for this is just how funny Tolkien is. And why don't you say a little bit more about that? Because I think we think of the Lord of the Rings as a serious book, which it certainly is. But there are moments of levity and humor, and I think they come across in this section of the chapter. So
yeah,
beautifully.
They do. I think the description of the party and the preparations for the party are really beautiful. I was also really interested in the fact that the pavilion is like the old tree is like inside the tent.
I never noticed that. I've read this book.
I never noticed
so
that
many
before.
times.
It must be huge.
I just noticed that the first time. I mean, laughably, like, improbably.
I mean,
huge.
it's like it's like a castle tent, basically. I mean,
I don't think you can physically build a tent that big
unless you're a dwarf, right? Like a dwarf can, right?
There's something magical about it. I love that he invites everybody that he can think of in the countryside, but of course there are a few people who are overlooked.
Yeah, that's so funny.
And so here it says, practically everyone living near was invited. A very few were overlooked by accident, But as they turned up all the same, that did not matter.
Yeah, and
Like, that's high comedy.
and I wonder if, I mean, by accident means that they were, that's what they were told, right?
But
like,
it didn't matter because they showed up anyway.
But Bilbo didn't invite them because he didn't want to invite them. You know, I don't think he likes most of these people. And so, we're told he doesn't have friends, and there's a reason for that. And then he tells them, he says, it's such a famous line. I don't know half of you half as well as I should like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. And
Just crushing.
And then it says, this was unexpected and rather difficult. There was some scattered clapping, but most of them were trying to work it out and to see if it came to a compliment. Like,
see if it came to a compliment.
I love that. Is he complimenting us, or does he want to know us better? No, he doesn't. He doesn't know him, and he doesn't want to know him. And maybe but there's also a humility where it's like, you deserve better than what I've given you. It's
like, look, I hate some of your guts, but I know that that's my fault, not yours.
Exactly. It's beautiful. It's funny.
It's so funny.
It's self-deprecating and offensive at the same time. And it's like, how do you fault somebody that, that can that has that kind of perspective on life? It's so beautiful.
You're so right. And like his perspective that he got from his journey, he is different than everybody.
Yeah.
There's that tension. Like when he's starting a speech, it says that, they were all essentially like drunk enough that they were ready to endure the speech.
Yeah. Cause he's known for giving sort of speeches that drone on and that are full of poetry and
little bits of what he calls poetry.
Yeah. And then God, now he's going to start talking about, the dragon and his, journey with the
Here we go again.
It's like, and nobody really believes it. Right. Like,
no. And there's a point when he hits a pause in his speech after he's given them a compliment, and it says that everyone bursts into applause, and then everyone assumes that he's done. So some of the young hobbits get some instruments and start playing a song and dancing on the tables, and he has to get a horn and toot it 3 times and be like, oh yeah, actually I have a few more things to say.
This section, it's a joke a minute. Like, it reminds me of like a show like what's that Tina Fey show?
30 Rock,
where it's just like joke, so he's sort of up there talking, he's insulting people, he's calling Proudfoot's proud feet. He's unwilling to be corrected in that. And he calls them a gross, which is hilarious.
And they take offense because it's something that's used for baggage and not for human beings.
Especially the Sackville Bagginses were insulted, feeling sure that they had been asked to fill up the required number, like goods in a package.
One gross indeed, vulgar expression. Yeah.
Yeah. He goes kind of crazy near the end of the speech.
He says, thirdly and finally, I wish to make an announcement.
All in caps, announcement.
Announcement. And he says it spoke the last word so loudly and suddenly that everyone sat up who still could. Oh, what a great little, those who could still stand.
Some are too drunk to stand up.
I regret to announce that though, as I said, 11 years is far too short a time to spend among you. This is the end.
The end.
I am going now. Goodbye.
I'm leaving now. Goodbye. Even the typesetting, the typesetting in my edition, announcement
is
like huge, and there's almost like a space between each letter. I don't know if yours is like that, but
it is.
It's really, he kind of goes nuts at the end, and he is a little nuts. I mean, Bilbo's kind of a crazy person,
He's just mad Baggins, man.
Yeah, and then he vanishes, of course, and there's a flash of light, which we find out later. Gandalf added in because he was like, people don't just disappear.
Yeah, I didn't want people to know about this potentially evil, malevolent, magical ring that you've been holding on to the last 60 years.
Maybe he doesn't want that story to get outside of the Shire, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, he
Um,
already has this kind of like inkling that
yeah,
Bilbo shouldn't reveal his magic this early.
right.
Um, but then they say, yes, there's something fishy in this, my dear. I believe that Mad Baggins is off again, silly old fool. But why worry? He hasn't taken the victuals with him.
That's
You know,
their
and victuals,
always their orientation is toward.
if we haven't said earlier, you know, victuals is like this kind of like old word for food and drink.
Vittles is a great word. I'm gonna start using that, I think, in my life. Let's go get some vittles.
You know, so of course we get this kind of like final exchange between Gandalf and Bilbo. They're kind of parting words, and
It gets intense.
it gets very intense. And this is something that uh you know, I don't think I really fully appreciated. Maybe it's because I have the image from the movie in my head when I'm reading this, but you know, Gandalf, he says essentially, you know, I hope that everything's going according to plan.
Right.
You know, and I hope that
The whole plan.
you'll the whole plan,
Yeah.
you know, which means leaving the ring behind. And Bilbo kind of shrugs it off. He's like, yes, yes, yes. You know, I have it in an envelope in the mantelpiece, but then he realizes, no, actually, I have it here in my
It's
pocket.
in my pocket.
And then his tone shifts, and he gets angry with Gandalf, and he's like, you know, why are you bothering me about this? It's mine. And then he calls it my precious.
Yeah, and you're like, oh,
You know, that's that first signal. It's like, oh, something is off about this ring. You know, it has an unnatural hold on him. And Gandalf says, you know, it's been called that before.
does he say by Gollum?
Let me check the text, because I know he does in the movie, and I don't want to.
Oh no, Bilbo actually says that. So the wizard's face remained grave and attentive, and only a flicker in his deep eyes showed that he was startled and indeed alarmed. It has been called that before, he said, but not by you. But I say it
Yeah,
now, and why not? Even if Gollum said the same once, it's not his now, but mine, and I shall keep it, I say.
he says, you will be a fool if you do.
Yeah, he stands up, spoke sternly. You'll be a fool if you do, Bilbo. I like that he says. This is another piece that's sort of funny, where he says, Gandalf says, the only reason I could see for this party in the first place was to get rid of the ring. Like the whole
Yes.
thing is kind of foolishness, right? And like,
Yeah.
Gandalf is willing to entertain it because he knows, or is hoping, that the end is that Bilbo gives the ring up.
Exactly.
But the whole rigmarole, all the party, the giving, you know, I'm sure Gandalf had to do some Gandalf, I think, had to do some coordination. Like, I mean, how many dwarves does Bilbo really know near the Shire, right? I know that he goes off on walks and stuff like that, but like, you kind of imagine, I think you can imagine Gandalf sort of being like, okay, like, yeah, I'll get some dwarves, you know, to come all the way from Dale with all this stuff, literally just so we can get this
Right.
ring out of your pocket.
This journey that was basically an entire book
Yeah,
in The Hobbit.
and now he's
just
sitting
getting
here.
to Dale.
Now he's sitting here in Bag End, and Bilbo's like, "Well, I'm going to keep it." And Gandalf's like, "The fuck you are!
Yeah.
Put
Yeah.
that shit on the mantelpiece."
You know, he's like, he's essentially like begging him. He's like, hey, like, this thing clearly has a hold on you.
Yeah.
Like, he even says, like, let it go, and then you can go yourself and be free.
Yes.
Like, he recognizes, he sees like Bilbo's turn into obsession and being possessed by the ring.
Yeah.
And it gets to the point where, and this is something that, you know, like I said earlier, it's hard not to separate the vision of the movie from the scene. And in the movie, Bilbo says, you want it for yourself. And he kind of like puts up his hands in kind of like a boxing stance. He's like, you know, like kind of like a why I oughta, you know, and
Yeah.
it shows him kind of like step towards Gandalf. And that's in the movie where Gandalf gets larger.
Yeah.
And he says, Bilbo Baggins, and he gets larger and the room goes dark. In the book, it says, I won't give my precious away. I tell you. He says, well, if you want my ring yourself, say so, but you won't get it. I won't give my precious away, I tell you.
Then he puts his
His
hand on
hand
his.
strayed to the
Yes.
hilt of his small sword. So he's about to pull a sword on Gandalf to protect the ring. And so that's so extreme. These are people who have known each other for Bilbo's entire life.
Over 50 years.
60 years since the quest.
Yeah. Yeah.
The entire year long of the quest. But in The Hobbit, it says that Bilbo
He knew
and
him
his
before.
family
Yeah.
knew him his entire life.
Right.
And
That's
so
right.
this is his oldest, dearest friend, his like trusted advisor, and he's about to pull a sword on him because he's so obsessed with the ring. And that darkness, I think, is something that we have to reckon with. Like Bilbo is willing to kill to keep the ring. And that's when Gandalf says, I'm not a thief. I'm not trying to rob you. I'm trying to help you.
Well, and I want to go back real quick here too and say, it'll be, first of all, he says it will be my turn to get angry soon. I think he is getting angry. Says his eyes flash, and then you'll see Gandalf the Grey uncloaked. He takes a step toward the Hobbit. In the movie, right, like the light sort of goes off and like darkness gathers around Gandalf. That's
Right.
not exactly what happens here. It says that he takes a step toward the Hobbit, and he seemed to grow tall and menacing. I think his shadow filled up the little room. I think he steps in front of the fire, and from Bilbo's perspective, suddenly it's dark. This, he's like the size of a child, right? As a hobbit,
Right.
and this
Right.
fully grown person sort of steps out of this visage that he has as an old man, like a wizened old man, like literally wizened, right? He's a wizard.
Right.
But that, I think that the movie invades our sense of imagination, because I think, though there may be something magical going on here, I always want to say, and I think I'll probably say this 100 times, as we're reading through this book, everything that happens that's magical has an explanation which is more grounded than what we expect from a fantasy novel. Like, yes, this is high fantasy, but it breaks all the conventions of high fantasy that follow the book. Like the expectations that we have of high fantasy is this sort of like hackneyed thing that, like, is all based on Tolkien. It's like, no, not really. Like, they're interpretations that are not necessarily grounded in what we're actually reading on the page.
Right.
And so there's something about him standing up, which is going to be threatening if you're the size of a child, and then to take a step forward into the room in front of the fire. We know that there's a mantelpiece there, or in front of whatever, kind of limited candlelight is in there. The room is going to get dark when somebody that large stands up in a little house meant for a hobbit. And
that's such a great point.
And so I just want to like live in the kind of like simplicity of that in a way as I'm reading the book, because I think that it's very easy to, imagine special effects happening. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's still this like simple interplay between these two people. And I think that helps
these two old friends.
Yeah. And I think that helps us ground our concern. Like, we can like ground our like understanding of Gandalf's concern for Bilbo, right? He has a professional concern and a personal concern, and it's happening between two people, not between two, CGI like generated special effects on screen.
That's such a great
way. Anyway, I want to keep kind of coming back to that, because I think it's important to reimagine this as we are reading through it.
Absolutely. And it seems like Gandalf kind of shakes Bilbo out of it, like spiritually, not physically.
Yeah, absolutely.
But he says, like, go away and leave it behind. Stop possessing it. Give it to Frodo and I will look after him. And Bilbo agrees. And, what he does is he says, I really must be starting. And he grabs his bag and he starts walking out the door. And Gandalf says, hey,
Bilbo.
you still got the ring in your pocket.
Yeah.
And he says, well, so I have, and my will and all the other documents too. You had better take it and deliver it for me. That would be safest. And Gandalf says, no, don't give the ring to me. Put it on the mantelpiece. It will be safe enough there till Frodo comes. I shall wait for him. And I think there's this misconception that's as easy to fall into, where you might think of the ring as this like radioactive evil thing that if you touch it, you immediately become possessed by it.
Right.
But Gandalf does handle the ring several times through the story. And I think in the next chapter, we'll see that he does touch it. It's not something that he can't touch, but it is something that's dangerous to be given.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like what he's avoiding is not touching the ring. In fact, he, in a minute, he stoops down and picks it up,
right,
and puts it on the mantelpiece. It's not that he can't touch it; it's that he can't be given it. And I think we'll see this idea of claiming the ring or being given the ring is itself what's dangerous. It's not touching it; it's being offered it.
Right.
And Gandalf, echoing like what will happen later with Galadriel, when he's offered the ring, he denies being given it. And I think you can see, like, maybe the danger is that if Bilbo says, hey, why don't you take this for me?
Mm-hmm.
Then what might happen, the temptation would be for him to say, oh, it is mine. In fact, Bilbo gave it to me.
Right.
And it seems like that's what he's avoiding. That's something that's really subtle, but I think is important. One of the most common things about Lord of the Rings, and people listening to this might have a similar experience. The first few times that I read this book, and maybe, you and I have read it together now once before we even started this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the questions that I always kind of come back to is, what exactly does the ring do?
Yeah. It's a really good question.
Like, what is the ring exactly? Like, what is its power? It makes you invisible, but it also has this corrupting effect. And, one of the most common questions that I get from people about Lord of the Rings is like, what exactly, and how hilarious is it that we have a book called The Lord of the Rings?
And nobody knows what it actually does.
Where the ring is the central part, and it's still like, after, how long is the single, 1025 some odd pages.
Yeah.
People can get to the very end of the book and still be like, okay, so
how does that work? Yeah.
What exactly?
Right.
And I think if this was a modern book, that the magic of the ring would be spelled out like Dungeons and Dragons style.
Yeah, it
would be,
you get a magical system like explaining, exactly how this works.
Almost like mathematically, logically, this is exactly how it works. But Tolkien really never gives us that.
Yeah, I think that's
part of what makes it so special.
I think so too, that there's a lot of questions and mystery and gaps, there. But they're like intentional gaps, it's not a mistake. He didn't forget to explain how the ring works. He invites you to figure it out or to reflect on it. And I think what you said, that the fact that it's not radioactive is really important, because it's more about the heart of the person.
Yes.
And their sort of the way that they existentially understand themselves in relation to the ring, and like the promise that the ring gives.
Yes.
It's not the fact that you touch it or move it from one place to another, grab it out of the fire as he does later. But it's like, he can very easily pick it up off the ground, even though it's in an envelope, pick it up off the ground, put it on the mantelpiece. Gandalf is not tempted in that moment, or at least we don't hear that he's tempted. Right. The problem is the idea of understanding yourself to possess the ring. And whether you actually possess it or not, that will work on your heart, which we see with, again, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but we see that with Boromir later. Boromir thinks of himself as possessing the ring. He imagines it. And and desires it, and it's the imagination and the desire and the understanding of myself is possessing it, which starts to work on that. And we even see that in this chapter with Frodo,
Yes.
that he has a ring fingering moment
Yeah.
as well, and it's because he possesses it. It's because it's in his
Yes.
pocket. It's because he thinks of it as his.
Yes.
Gandalf never thinks of the ring as his.
No.
And even though he must have had some, I think you have to imagine that Gandalf had some kind of like moment of, the same kind of moment that Galadriel has or gets past. But in this moment, it's not a issue. But the issue to be handed it and be like, here, it's yours. You keep it. Like Gandalf's like, no.
Yeah. Don't say you take it to me, because
Yeah.
that's the thing that's actually dangerous.
That is deadly. And but that doesn't happen in a magical way. I think it happens in the heart of the person. Which again is why I think it's important to understand Gandalf as Gandalf standing up, Gandalf moving toward Bilbo, Gandalf getting angry, as not mystical. It's just human, you know.
It's almost like he's talking to Bilbo the way that someone might talk to a loved one or a family member
Logan,
who.
put down your phone.
Well, I was going to take it even further.
I know you were, but this is personal for me. Put down your fucking phone. Like, why are you worried about where it is?
And I think you know exactly where I was going to take it. Of like, can you please like stop being possessed by alcohol, or can you please stop being possessed by heroin, or can you please stop being possessed by, like enter a vice or an addictive thing here,
right?
Where, Bilbo, like the way that Bilbo talks, I think you and I have seen personally so many people who are addicted to drugs, like that almost cliche phrase of like, I could quit anytime I want.
Right.
I just don't want to.
Yep.
And it's like, can you?
Yeah.
Like, do you possess it or does it possess you? I think that's the kind of level of like of power that this ring has over Bilbo.
Right.
So much so that like even, when he says that he's going to give it up, he drops it on the floor. Says Bilbo took out the envelope, but just as he was about to set it by the clock, his hand jerked back and the packet fell to the floor. Before he could pick it up, the wizard stooped and seized it and set it in its place. A spasm of anger passed swiftly over the hobbit's face again. Suddenly it gave way to a look of relief and a laugh. That's the moment that it breaks. Gandalf very subtly intervenes.
Yeah.
And, touches it, picks it up,
right,
puts it where Bilbo was going to place it. And that's the moment that just breaks in, Bilbo suddenly himself again. And that's when he leaves.
Yeah. Relief is really relief and laughter. Wow.
Right.
That's a freedom. There's a joy, something about joy counteracts the power of the ring. Well, that's that, he said. Now I'm off. And he's going to do the thing that he wants to do. He's going into, a journey toward the mountains, toward the elves, toward the country that he loves. And
he's free.
And he uses a lot of exclamation points. Now I'm off. Is everything ready? Well, let's start then. What fun. Dwarves, every sentence has a exclamation point after he finally gives up the ring.
He's like back to himself.
And then he sings.
Back to his lightness.
Then he sings. The road goes ever on and on.
That's worth reading.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Why don't you read that poem, that song?
The road goes ever on and on, down from door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet. until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet. And whither then, I cannot say. He says he's being swept off his feet.
Yeah. Like it's a river.
And I'm happy now as I've ever been, and that's saying a great deal. Bilbo's lived a great life. I'm going to cry. I mean, God. I had to sing a great deal. But the time has come. I'm being swept off my feet at last. I mean, he lets go of this terrible burden.
Yeah.
And for some reason he's weird enough that possessing the ring all these years hasn't, he's like just made a different stuff, Bilbo is.
Anybody else it would have ruined them. And we get this insight into like how it almost did, like he was on the brink of becoming Gollum himself.
Absolutely.
Even adopting the same language and the same violence.
Yeah. Something about the care that Gandalf has for him and his intervening allows him to finally put it down. And then suddenly he's swept off his feet. I'm like, what? I'm swept off my feet. I am being swept off my feet at last.
Yeah.
He's like entering a stream or a flow or a power beyond himself that is so much bigger than what the ring is. Yeah. And then he sings. And like anytime somebody starts to like, sing, he sang softly as if to himself, softly in the dark. He sings a song to himself. I mean, it's like a moment of praise for his like divine whatever. I mean,
deliverance.
And you're like, it's so beautiful. And Gandalf just sits there and witnesses it. He just bears witness to this like beautiful moment. And then Gandalf says goodbye until our next meeting. And then he went back inside. And that's the lot. You don't see him again for like, I don't know, 150 pages or something like that.
For the rest of book 1. Yeah, we don't see him again until like the second half of Rivendell.
Yeah. And so that's a beautiful moment. And then we get Frodo. Frodo comes in. Stage left.
Frodo comes in. And the rest, there's only about 5 pages left in the chapter.
Yeah.
The rest of it is just kind of buttoning up the aftermath of the story.
Yeah, he's got to like deal with all the kind of like loose ends and giving away gifts and things that he's got to help Bilbo make fun of everybody with all these notes.
Here's the spoons. Here's the spoons that you like. Here's the rest of the spoons that you stole from me 60 years ago.
And like some of these things it's all pretty lighthearted. He gives an umbrella to Adelard who's like stolen many unlabeled ones, and
a waste paper basket to somebody
to Dora Baggins, who gives a lot of advice.
Wrote too many letters. Good advice.
So great.
The tip top though has to be giving the young Hobbit girl a mirror.
Yeah.
Because she spends too much time looking at herself in the mirror and, thinks of herself as her face being shapely.
Right.
Just, peak British humor.
So good.
Just so good. Oh, also they hire gardeners to come and cart away the people who are too drunk to leave by themselves the next morning.
Yeah. In wheelbarrows. It's so good. There was one piece that I wanted to mention that I thought was so funny.
The final burn against Frodo by Lobelia.
Yeah, Lobelia. That Mary's saying like he's indisposed. He's resting, and they just won't take no for an answer. And then at the end, Frodo is finally getting her out the door, and she turns around and says, "You'll live to regret it, young fella. Why didn't you go too? You don't belong here. You're no Baggins. You're a Brandybuck." And he says, "Did you hear that, Mary? That was an insult, if you like," said Frodo as he shut the door. "It was a compliment," said Mary Brandybuck. And so, of course, not true. Hilarious.
So funny.
So of course,
So
not
funny.
true. It's like she couldn't give a compliment if she tried. Oh, I love it. But she, she has her redemption moment in the story too. We got years before we talk about that, but there is something Baggins-ish about her in the end. So,
and then it ends with Gandalf saying goodbye to Frodo and giving him one final warning not to dare use the ring.
yeah. How many stories end with so many goodbyes, but I think that's a pretty classic it's a pretty classic storytelling convention, right? That we're leaving some piece of our life behind and entering into this narrative. I love that he does it all within a chapter. We say goodbye to Bilbo, we say goodbye to Gandalf, and then the story becomes Frodo's.
Yeah.
And then Frodo takes a little longer, 17 years or so for Frodo to finally get out of the Shire, but
and we'll talk about that next
week.
next chapter. Right. Yeah, the almost glacial pace with which it takes for the actual story to begin.
Yeah, it slows down a little bit. But
Gandalf warns him. He says, "Don't use it. It may have other powers than just making you vanish when you wish to."
Yeah.
And he says, "Look for me when you least expect it."
Right.
Look out for me, especially at unlikely times.
He says that a couple times. That's so funny too.
Yes.
I mean, what a weird old guy.
Yeah, because you can't expect someone when you don't expect them, or else you would be expecting them. It's such a great play on words.
I think Frodo's probably just like, okay, I don't know exactly what that means, but it's fine. He knows Gandalf pretty well too, I guess. So
good old Gandalf.
Yeah.
And then he leaves. And he vanishes into the twilight, and Frodo did not see him again for a long time.
That's great.
But we will,
indeed,
next week. We will tackle Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past.
Kind of a change in tone from our long expected party, and then now we've got a shadow coming.
That's right.
All the levity is it doesn't last.
Well, that was a fun chapter to read with you, man.
Yeah, man,
and
totally.
I think one of my favorites of the book starts out really strong.
It does.
And yeah, next week we come to the changing of the tone.
Well, thank you for reading along with us this week. If you want to help us out, share this podcast with a Lord of the Rings fan in your life. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, and visit waywardwizards.com for more info. May the hair on your toes never fall out. We'll see you next week.